everyone, welcome to our second LP research workshop. My name is Professor Ashley Arrington. I'm going to be walking you through our workshop today. And our focus today is on step 2 of the 4-step research process, wherein we look to secondary sources. So let's think back to our very first workshop, and during that workshop we introduced our 4-step research process. So this process is intended to really give you something that you can grab onto so that when you sit down to work on a research project, whether it's an LP, whether it's during your first internship or clerkship, and you have a legal research question, you can go to this 4-step process and just have a plan for how you're walking through your research, right? So I want you to reflect on what those steps were. So you'll recall that our first step was our issue analysis step. And that's where we essentially are orienting ourselves to the problem, right? We talked about the 5 W's that, we learned in likely elementary school, right? Where you think about your who, what, when, where, why, right? So your who is not only the parties, but what's the relationship between the parties, right? Is there a legally significant relationship? Are we thinking about landlord-tenant, or are we thinking about doctor-patient, right? That relationship might be significant. We're thinking about what's happening, right? What is the precise situation? What are the facts at issue? And then we're thinking about when, right? When did this happen? Is this potential claim barred by the statute of limitations, right? We want to think about when. We want to think about where. Where did this happen, right? What jurisdiction are we working within? Are there perhaps multiple jurisdictions, right? And then your why, right? What are you seeking? Why are you pursuing this, right? So thinking about your cause of action. What are the potential causes of action that you could assert? And then also anticipating the defenses to those causes of action, right? What need you be prepared for as an attorney? In response to the claim that you're building, right? So those are the factors that we're thinking about, right? We're thinking about a number of different things as we go through that issue analysis step. So that was step 1, right? So today we're going to dig into step 2, which is focused on secondary sources, and we'll see that there's a reason why we look to secondary sources before we look to primary sources of law. So we'll do secondary sources today, and then next workshop we'll move into step 3, which is focused on codified law, and that is the law that's been translated into a code, right? So we want to find that those specific law, if there is indeed law that is on point for our question, before we look to step 4, where we look at case law, right? Because we want to know about that codified law, if it exists, before we start to look at the case law wherein courts have debated as to where that codified law is applied, how that codified law is applied, right? So that's kind of where we're at with our 4-step process. As I said, we're going to move into step 2 and focus on secondary sources today. I want to also call your attention back to our discussion on the Next Gen Bar exam. And as you know, you will be the first class to sit for the Next Gen Bar exam. Y'all are just the guinea pigs, right? You took a new LSAT, and now you'll take a new bar exam, right? So the good news is that the 4-step process that we're going to look at throughout the fall semester and build on in the spring semester lines up. It really mirrors what NextGen has used in their own documentation with respect to the areas that they want to test with respect to legal research, right? So our step one, the language that NCBE, the National Conference of Bar Examiners, uses in this NextGen documentation is they want to test an examinee's ability to identify issues in a client matter. The language says including legal, factual, and evidentiary issues. But that's our step one, right? That's our issue analysis. Finding out where we're at, what area of law, what issue of law are we dealing with, right? And then today we're moving into secondary sources. And the language that they use is research secondary sources. Okay, so that's mirrors our step process as well. Then they do move into codified law. Our step 3 we call codified law. We're going to focus on statutes this fall semester when we get to codified law, next workshop. And NCBE says that they will test an examinee's ability to research statutory authority, right? So codified law with a focus on statutes, just like we'll look at next time. And then finally, testing an examinee's ability to research case law authority, okay? And again, as you saw, when we get to step 4, our focus will be on case law. So in terms of what you're learning and the application to the bar exam, you're in a good spot, right? Not all law schools or first-year law students are pursuing a research curriculum that is directly in line with this NextGen documentation. So we're going to do all that we can to ensure that you're best prepared to sit for this new exam. Okay, so with that said, let's get into our discussion of secondary sources. And I want to ask you, what is the difference between a primary source and a secondary source? What is a secondary source, right? And we see this definition here. Secondary sources are sources that explain, interpret, and analyze primary sources of law, right? So what is primary law? That's the actual law, right? It could be codified law, it could be case law, but it is the law that is applied. And secondary sources are sources that, again, are helping us to understand that area of law, to get some background with an area of law or more precise issue of law before we move into those primary sources, okay? So I do want to say what you've been exposed to thus far. You're just a few weeks into your law school experience, right? But you're seeing what your doctrinal courses look like. And so what are you doing in your doctrinal courses? You're sitting and reading specific cases, digging out facts. You're learning how to brief cases, which is wonderful, right? But that's not what you're going to be doing in practice, right? You're not digging into case law immediately, right? You are doing the things that we're talking about in our workshops by starting with secondary sources before moving into primary sources, right? You want to understand the area of law before you dive into those cases, right? So it does look different. It looks different in practice from what you're seeing right now as a first-year law student. Now, what are the benefits of secondary sources, right? Why are we looking to secondary sources before looking at primary sources? What is the law, right? So again, they help us to understand these legal issues, these areas of law that are new to us, right? They give us some background to help us understand where we're going, what we're dealing with, right? Before we start digging into that law, we have an understanding of the types of terminology that will be used in that discussion, right? So we're prepared. It's just like our issue analysis, right? We do our own analysis before we move into our full research process. Same thing here, right? When you approach research, you're looking to secondary sources to orient yourself, analyze the law before you dig further and move into those precise pieces of law. So that's one big reason, right? The other big reason is that it links us to primary authority, okay? So that makes us more effective researchers, right? So if we if we start with secondary sources, we'll be pointed towards primary sources. So we're not only gaining an understanding of the background for that particular area or specific issue of law, we're also being pointed towards relevant codified law, relevant case law, right? And this is much more efficient than jumping into a database and searching for cases, right? Save yourself the time and energy by starting with a secondary source to then get to the relevant pieces of law more effectively and quickly, right? More efficiently as well. Right, so we see our image at right here. So when we're thinking about primary law, right, that primary law, which would be, again, codified law, could be case law as well. Though that law could be mandatory for your particular jurisdiction. It could be persuasive for your jurisdiction, right? We're looking at a couple of things there. We're looking at what jurisdiction is the law coming from, right? Is it my jurisdiction? And then also, what level of court are we looking at? Like, is my the court that I'm working within bound by a higher court, right? Or is this a lower court and thus considered persuasive rather than mandatory? Secondary sources, what we're talking about today, are, again, they're not law. They're sources that help us to understand the law. And because of that, they are not binding, right? They're not considered mandatory authority. However, they are hugely beneficial for the reasons that we've talked about here. So let's talk about a few different types of secondary sources, right? So dictionaries, right? You're used to using dictionaries in your past experiences personally and within your studies, right? So just like you have a dictionary where you can define specific terms, you'll find those within the law as well, right? And you probably have heard the big one that is a reference is Black's Law Dictionary. You may find that your firm even has those in print. You can find Black's Law Dictionary on Westlaw, right? But that's an important secondary source to look to. Encyclopedias. You've dealt with encyclopedias before as well, right? So an encyclopedia gives you a more comprehensive background and understanding of a particular area, a particular topic, right? By providing articles related to that topic. And we'll talk about some of the more popular encyclopedias in Texas and at the federal level. Then we've got treatises, right? So treatises are getting more specific, right? They can be focused, they generally are focused on a single topic or area of law, right? And these things are drafted by experts. So you may see, I'm trying to think of an example. You can see in the image here, right? Williston on contracts. So Williston is the expert, right? And he's writing a treatise specifically on contracts focused on that area of law, okay? Now, those sources that we just looked at are more focused on gaining background knowledge, right? What about if we want to go deeper? We have that background knowledge solidified. We want to move more specifically into our precise issue. So, we just talked about treatises. Treatises can also be more specific, right? So again, they're more comprehensive, but they can be on a topic of law, like contracts, like our Williston on contracts example, or they could be specific to a narrower topic within the area of contracts, right? So they can be broader or narrower. Journal articles, right? So journal articles, you may publish a journal article during your law school career, right? So these are lengthy articles. They're drafted by usually professors, right, who are considered experts on a particular topic or issue of law. Sometimes by law students, right? If you pursue a journal, you'll also be working on drafting an article. But the difference here is that when you're looking at a journal article, it's very specific, right? Like, it is not just a particular area of law or even a particular issue, but a very precise question, right? And so you're really only digging into journal articles if you've identified a very precise issue and question that you're researching. You're not starting there because you want that background first, right? And then you see ALR, which is what you see in this image right here, stands for American Law Reports. And these are a popular secondary source within the law. They have annotations, which are just notes, right, that are specific to a particular topic of law. And it really gives you an idea of some of the important cases, right, that are relevant to your particular issue. Now, practical secondary sources. We'll get further into this when you move into your 2L and 3L years. However, I do want you to be cognizant of some of these at the outset. So, right, practice aids. These are materials. You can see this image here, O'Connor's Texas Family Law Forms. So O'Connor is the author. He's putting together this practice guide that is focused on Texas family law forms, okay? So as an expert, as a legal practitioner, he's providing guidance on how to deal with various forms, right? Some treatises can be more practical. We talked about they could be broader, they could be more narrow, they can also be more practice focused. CLE materials, right, your continuing legal education that you'll be required to do each year when you become licensed. Those can also provide really practical tips, right, and those are considered secondary sources as well. And then, again, we'll get to this when you get further into your law school experience. There are sub-databases within Westlaw and Lexis that are more practice-focused. We'll look at some of those in the spring. Westlaw's version is called Practical Law, and Lexis' version is called Practical Guidance. And so we can find additional, more practice-focused materials that are drafted by expert practitioners, right? Bloomberg Law also has a couple of sources. Their practice center and their practical guidance pages are really helpful. But again, you'll dig further into Bloomberg as you move into your 2L or 3L years. Nonetheless, I want you to be aware of the fact that there are more practitioner-focused materials as well. Okay, so now let's take some time to look at secondary sources both on Lexis and Westlaw. Let's start by looking at Westlaw first. Here we are on our home page, right? There's a couple ways that we can get to secondary sources. You see our second to top bar here, right? That says secondary sources. You can click into secondary sources. You can also go from this page into content types. And then from there, you can click into secondary sources. They're going to take you to the same place, right? Once we do this, we see that we can narrow by type of secondary source. So we talked about encyclopedias, we talked about American law reports, we talked about CLE materials, right? So we could narrow by type. You can also narrow by jurisdiction. So you may move into Texas to look at those more Texas-specific secondary sources. And then you can also narrow by topic, right? So if you're interested in commercial law, you want to look at secondary sources that are specific to commercial law, you can do that as well. And then finally, you can search by specific practice publication series, right? So Texas Practice Guides, Texas Practice Series, and you can move into those as well. I want to go back to our homepage once again and point out that if you have a particular source you know the name of and you know that's where you want to go, you can simply type that in the top search bar. Okay, so I mentioned that Black's Law Dictionary is available on Westlaw. So when I type in Black's Law Dictionary, right, we see it pop up as a content page. Okay, so I'm going to move into Black's Law Dictionary here. And then I could search here. I could put the dictionary term here, or I can search it here. And I'll use quotation marks, right? I'll use attractive nuisance as an example. And I will search for attractive nuisance within Black's Law Dictionary. Okay, and we see it pop up here. Now we can move into that, attractive nuisance. And then it tells us see nuisance, right? So what is that saying? They don't have a more specific definition for attractive nuisance. We want to move into nuisance generally. And then we can look to see if we have a definition specific to attractive nuisance there. And we do, right? Okay, so that's Black's, which is, again, a popular source that you'll use in practice. And then I also want to point to, I mentioned some encyclopedias that are important at the federal level and then within Texas as well. So American Jurisprudence is your national, very popular encyclopedia. But if we want to look to a Texas-specific encyclopedia, we can go to Texas Jurisprudence. Okay, so let's do that. And then I want to point out, so here's our table of contents, right? So one thing that we could do is to browse and look for the area of law that we're interested in, and then the more specific issue, right? But Westlaw also has the index at top right. So we can use the index, which is very helpful. So we'll click into index contents. Okay. And then it's organized by letter, right? So I'm going to search for attractive nuisance once again. So I just did Command F, right? And then, or Control F rather. And then I see attractive nuisances. And it's taken me to all of the encyclopedic entries, right, that are specific to attractive nuisances. And then I can get more narrow from there, right? So this is helpful in getting us where we need to go as well, right? You could use the search within using that top search bar, as we did with Black's. You could also use the index, which is another helpful tool. You will find more indexes available on Westlaw over Lexis. So keep that in mind, but you can and should look for indexes on both because, again, they can be really helpful in getting you where you need to go. Okay, so one last source I want to point out is O'Connor's, and we mentioned that as a source that you may use in LP. It's also a very just popular source used in practice. Okay, so when I type in O'Connor's, again, because that's how I know where I want to go, right, we see a number of versions. We see one that's specific to codes and rules, several that are specific to Texas issues, right? And so I just want to point that particular source out as a popular one that you may use in LP as well as in the practice of law. Next, we'll look at Lexis. We're on the home page here, and in the same way that we did on Westlaw, we can narrow into content and then secondary materials from the main page. So you can see here under secondary materials, it gets subdivided into treatises and guides versus law reviews and journals. But I'm going to click into the more comprehensive secondary materials. So you can see that you can narrow into national sources, right? We talked about American Law Reports. We talked about AmJur as our national legal encyclopedia, right? You could narrow by content type, like we did on Westlaw, move specifically into dictionaries, move specifically into treatises, right? Again, you can narrow by state. You can narrow by specific publisher of those secondary materials, and you can narrow by practice area as well, right? You want to look for secondary sources specific to securities law or tax law. You can do that. So the state process is the same, right? So, for example, we can look at AmJur. So you'll notice here that there is no index at top right. If we were to look at this source on Westlaw, we would see an index just like we did for Texas jurisprudence, our Texas-focused legal encyclopedia, right? But that's not the case here. We're not seeing an index for that here, okay? I also want to point out again, if you know the name of a specific source, you can go directly to that source, okay? So I'm going to look for Dorsanio. Now this is a popular secondary source. If your firm offers access to Lexis, you will likely use Dorsanio's, right? Texas Litigation Guide is the first one that pops up, right? So let's go there. So here's an example, right? You could scan your table of contents, but again, pointing out that you can get to a specific source by typing it in the search bar if you know exactly where you're going. And note that secondary sources, different secondary sources are available on Lexis versus Westlaw. There are some that are on both platforms. There are some that are just on Westlaw. O'Connor's is an example. There are some that are just on Lexis. Dorsanio's is an example. So just keep that in mind. And what you have access to may depend on what your firm provides access to. If you have access to Westlaw, you'll be using more of O'Connor's. If you have access to Lexis, you'll be using more of Dorsanio's. And so it is important. You've got 3 years to explore these databases and resources. It is important for you to dig into each of them. You don't know what you're going to have access to when you move into practice. And so you want to have some basic level of competency with each of these databases. Now that we've looked at both Lexis and Westlaw and found where we can get to secondary sources, let's move into our in-class exercise. For our in-class exercise, today we'll focus on Westlaw. Our first question is asking us to find a definition, specifically of criminal trespass in Blacks, and as we said, Blacks is available on Westlaw and not Lexis. So again, we know exactly where we're going, so we'll move into Black's Law Dictionary, and then we can just put in our quotations our precise term, right? So we're going to look for criminal trespass. We're going to put that in quotation marks. And then we see a couple of things pop up. I'm going to start with criminal trespass because if there is a more specific definition there, we want to see that. Now, here this points us to trespass. Okay, so let's go to trespass generally and see if they have included a more specific definition for criminal trespass there, right? I'm, again, just doing Control F. Criminal trespass. So I see criminal trespass pop up here. And so they've told us that their definition for criminal trespass, they've housed under trespass, okay? So that's what you're seeing when you first see criminal trespass, points you to trespass, and then that's where they've housed that more specific definition, okay? Our next question tells us that our firm subscribes to Westlaw, right? So they often use O'Connor's Texas Causes of Action. And so they're telling us to go to that source and look up trespass to real property. Okay, so let's do that. Again, we know the name of the source. So we're going to go directly to that. We know we're looking for O'Connor's Texas Causes of Action. So we'll move into that. And now we're looking for trespass to real property as a cause of action. So where would we go, right? Probably start with part 2, causes of action, and browse there. And I'm looking for trespass. So I'm just going to Control F, see what I find there. And if I look to Chapter 29, that's exactly what I want, right? Trespass to real property, that's what we're looking for. Then when I click into trespass to real property, I see a specific section on plaintiff's elements. Okay, and that's our question. What are the plaintiff's elements? So, if you look through this, right, there are a few elements. The first one relates to plaintiff's property, right? Plaintiff must establish it owned or had a lawful right to possess the real property. Then we've got to scroll down. Now we get to element 2, right? Plaintiff must establish defendant's entry onto plaintiff's land was physical, intentionary, voluntary, and or unauthorized. And then we have to scroll even further to look for 2.3, which is ways down. Quite a ways down. Did I miss it? Okay, there we go. 2.3. And then again, we see the third element. Plaintiff must establish the defendant's trespass caused an injury to the plaintiff's right of possession. So that's a lot, right? So you may want to look to other sections because you may find this information in multiple subsections. Okay, so I can find those elements here, but let's see what happens when we go to section 1. That is general. Now we see an outline of those elements, okay? So the just like those longer pieces that we looked at in section 2, these just give us a summary, right? 1 is still plaintiff owned or had a lawful right to possess real property. 2 is still defendant entered the plaintiff's land and the entry was physical, intentional, voluntary, and unauthorized. And 3 is still defendant's trespass caused injury to the plaintiff's right of possession. Okay, so the point here is that you may find this information in multiple subsections, and so you want to look to those multiple subsections. Okay, that may come in handy in practice as well as it did here with our question 2. The next question on the in-class exercise asks how comparing different secondary sources enhances your understanding of a legal concept, and what factors affect their relevance and utility of these different secondary sources, right? So these varied sources provide different perspectives and levels of detail, right? We talked about some sources being more comprehensive, some being much more specific, getting to very specific issues or sub-issues, right? Like an encyclopedia is going to provide a broader overview, whereas a law review, again, we said those are looking at more specific questions. Relevance and utility, that can depend on a number of factors, right? What date? When was this source published? Who's it coming from, right? Thinking about authority. How specific is it? Is it specific to our question? Jurisdiction as well, right? Is this a Texas secondary source, or is this a secondary source coming from Maryland, which we're going to be less concerned with, right? So there are a number of factors we're going to look to for that. Lastly, I want to point out from the in-class exercise, the next gen questions are these are new, right? This is the first time we've developed these questions. These questions are intended solely to give you some exposure to what these types of questions might look like on the bar, okay? On the final assessment, they will not be graded. You'll be graded for did you complete those questions or not, right? You'll lose points if you just skipped the question, right? But if you didn't skip the question and you made a good faith effort, then you'll receive full credit even if you chose the wrong answer, okay? So our question asks, you're asked to help clarify the law for a potential trespass claim. Which secondary source would be most useful for determining plaintiff's required elements, right? And so the options here are Black's Law Dictionary, O'Connor's Texas Causes of Action, Texas Penal Code, and then a law review article on property rights in Texas. So let's talk about each of those. Black's Law Dictionary. That might be helpful for us to look up the definition of trespass, right? Is it going to be helpful for looking for specific elements? Probably not, right? It's just going to help us with a more general definition. O'Connor's Texas Causes of Action, right? We looked at that, and it did have a section. It had 2 sections, right? One was the longer version, and one was the shorter version, detailing those plaintiffs' required elements, okay? So far we like B, right? C, Texas Penal Code. Well, what is that? That's a statutory code, right? That is the law. That is not a secondary source, right? And our question is asking about a secondary source, so we can rule C out. And then D, law review article on property rights in Texas. That may or may not have some discussion about plaintiff's required elements, right? If we want to look to a source that we can trust is going to have those required elements or is most likely to have those required elements, we're going to look to B, right? O'Connor's Texas Causes of Action. It includes that checklist of those elements, right? And so it is the most directly useful source here. Okay. And then our final, our second next-gen question, it says, our client is considering bringing a trespass claim. A law clerk asks you which sources to consult first to clarify the definition and to identify the elements the plaintiffs must prove. Advise the law clerk on 2 specific secondary sources that would be most useful. Okay, so one piece is how do we look to the definition? Another piece is how do I identify the elements? we've looked at both of these already, right? We said Black's is going to be more helpful for a more comprehensive definition. So we could look to Black's for the legal definition of trespass. With respect to the plaintiff's elements, right? Again, we're going to look to O'Connor's, right? Because that's going to be a more specific discussion of those elements as opposed to just a general definition that we'd find in Black's, okay? And other sources could be relevant too, right? On the bar exam, as long as you identify two appropriate sources, you're good, right? You're going to gain credit and points for that when you take the bar. Next time, we will pick up with step 3, moving into codified law. And as we move into step 3, I want to ask you to ponder what is meant when we say codified law, right? So we know that codified law and case law are both types of primary law, the law itself. But let's think about how they differ, right? What is the precise definition? What do we mean when we say codified law? We'll move into step 3 during our next workshop. And then finally, we'll move into step 4 on case law. And then our very last session will be a review of our 4-step process. That is all I have for you today. If you have questions, know that we're available to help you. You can reach out to us in person. Just ask for us at the circulation desk. You can email us. You can email us at our reference email. Feel free to also email the librarians individually. You can call us, or probably the easiest way for you to reach us is via chat, and you'll see the chat box pop up as soon as you go to the Law Library webpage, or any page that you click into from the Law Library main webpage. You'll see it in the bottom right-hand corner. So again, reach out if you have questions, and thank you for your attention. We look forward to seeing you at our next workshop on step 3, focused on researching codified law. Thanks again. Bye-bye.